It's March 11th, 2004, and just last night, Zimbabwe made history, for all the wrong reasons. Yesterday, Zimbabwe had played Bangladesh at home and lost. It was their first ever ODI loss to Bangladesh in history. It also broke Bangladesh's winless streak in ODIs, one that had started half a decade ago in 1999. That morning, Zimbabwe's captain Heath Streak is called into a meeting with coach Jeff Marsh, along with some Zimbabwe Cricket Union management and some team selectors. Now, what could this meeting be about? Sure, last night's loss here in Harare was tough, but on the face of things, it seemed like a typical work meeting. But as we look back at it now, we couldn't be further from the truth. The meeting that was about to occur, and I'm not overstating it here, could be considered as the most consequential meeting in the history of Zimbabwean cricket. As the meeting is about to begin, other Zimbabwean Cricket Union members were joining in by phone, namely from the union's integration task force. Reportedly, it was felt by some that the makeup of the team wasn't representative enough of Zimbabwe's population. The task force said that the lineup needed to be changed, and reading in between the lines, they meant that it needed to have more non-white players. Heath Streak recalls his response in that meeting in a later interview. Quote, "This side's been selected by Ali Shah and Max Ibrahim and Stephen, so how can you say it's racist? There are no whites involved. Do you know the ramifications of doing this? Because the team's been announced and I'm not going to go and tell a guy he's been dropped and not tell him why." After heated discussions over the matter, with no concrete solution decided, the call was ended. A short time later, the head of the integration task force arrives at the ground with some people from the Mashonaland Cricket Association, arguably Zimbabwe's strongest cricket team at the time. They continue their argument face to face, and things get heated. There are threats to dig up the Harare cricket pitch unless the team is reselected. They had another game there with Bangladesh tomorrow. After some mediation, the lineup remained unchanged, but only after a pledge that changes would be made to selections in the future. Zimbabwe would experience the sweet taste of victory the next day, beating Bangladesh by 14 runs, eventually taking the series 2-1. This victory, however, wouldn't be enough to change the mind of Zimbabwe's captain. Around 2 weeks later, Heath Streak would submit a list of demands to the Zimbabwe Cricket Union, threatening to quit as team captain if his demands weren't met. What you are witnessing here is the start of the Zimbabwean cricket crisis, a period of time that would devastate Zimbabwean cricket for years, the remnants of which are still being felt to this day. This might have been the beginning of a crisis, but the momentum that instigated this in the first place started much earlier. To understand its true origins, we need to take a broader look at the situation in Zimbabwe at the time. We have covered Zimbabwe's history in more detail in an earlier video, one that's popping up on screen now. If you haven't watched it yet, I recommend that you do, because it'll give you the basis on what we're about to talk about right now. For more than 2 decades, Zimbabwe had been overseen by Robert Mugabe. Mugabe's regime and their actions had led to a significant deterioration in the quality of life for everyday Zimbabweans. From land reform that kicked farmers off their land, creating the conditions for critical food shortages and widespread poverty, to economic decisions that fueled inflation and budget deficits, and an atmosphere that made citizens think twice before speaking out, worried about retribution. It was the 2003 World Cup, co-hosted by Zimbabwe, where these problems were focused into the minds of cricket fans everywhere. The Chevrons campaign perhaps didn't meet expectations, but 2 Zimbabwean players, Andy Flower and Henry Alonga, donned black armbands as they took to the field in Zimbabwe's first match against Namibia, as a protest against the current situation in Zimbabwe and the death of democracy in their beloved country. At the end of that World Cup, while Andy and Henry's protest did shine a spotlight on Zimbabwe for a time, it did not result in any significant change internally. Robert Mugabe and his regime remained firmly in power and will do so for many years. But the impacts of those decisions, which we spoke about in that earlier video, were now creating an even more disastrous situation economically and on the ground for people in Zimbabwe. The situation around land reform and the seizure of farms manifested significant widespread ramifications. With reform came the breakup of large farms into smaller allotments, along with a significant decrease in agricultural production, with severe unemployment nationwide. The nationwide scale of these policies amplified its effects significantly. From being a net exporter for many of its crops, Zimbabwe became a net importer in only a few short years, hurting the Zimbabwean economy in a massive way. Zimbabwe not only didn't have the flows of money coming in from other countries who had bought their exported crops, Zimbabwe now also had significantly less money and had to go to other countries to buy what they needed to feed their own people. With the economy seriously deteriorating and existing stocks of grain being miscalculated, that shortfall in food wouldn't be properly rectified, and critical food shortages persisted. In such a situation, it's understandable why Zimbabwean citizens, or those who could afford it, would continue to emigrate from the country as well. Aid agencies such as the World Food Programme increased their support to Zimbabwe amidst growing food insecurity. With less supply of groceries and essentials for people to buy, the demand for what was already there exploded. Inflation had already begun to increase, and the actual monetary value of the local Zimbabwean dollar began to shrink further in value. Unfortunately, rather than seeking to stop the drivers of this inflation, the Zimbabwean government sought to print more money. Inflation would increase exponentially over the next few years, leading to hyperinflation, and the future issuance of notes like this one. Not only were larger and larger bundles of currency needed to buy everyday essentials, but there were local anecdotes of people ordering a coffee, and then by the time they finished it, the price of that coffee had increased due to that hyperinflation. And yet, due to his iron grip on power, Robert Mugabe remained in government. Since the early 2000s, allegations of political violence and attacks on free media after recent elections resulted in economic sanctions being placed by the EU and countries like the United States. These were targeted not only on Robert Mugabe personally, but members of his family and key members of the regime, and businesses that these people had interests in. These included a travel ban and the freezing of offshore assets where possible. Despite the fact that the sanctions were specifically targeted on those people and entities listed and not on Zimbabwe as a whole, Mugabe expertly used them as a vehicle to blame Zimbabwe's economic issues on outside forces, particularly in the West, diverting attention away from his own government's actions. His suppression of free speech, silencing opposition, and filling Zimbabwe's structures of power with supporters meant there was little chances of changing the status quo. So by now, maybe you're asking where that meeting we spoke about earlier comes into all of this. Well, that's a good question. The meeting with Heath Streak at the start of the video went to the heart of Robert Mugabe's goals to transform Zimbabwe. Under the guise of integration, Mugabe's moves in the government and the economy had the implicit motive of increasing the influence of certain Zimbabweans, often black, but more specifically those loyal to him, at the expense of those that were there beforehand, especially white Zimbabweans. With that intent, it's only natural that arguably the nation's most successful sports team that represents the country on the international stage would be in their sights.
In the air and should be out and is. Sahonda's got his man.
In 2001, the Zimbabwean Cricket Union established an internal task force known as the Integration Task Force. Its stated goal was to, quote, ensure the full, equitable and sustainable nationwide integration of Zimbabwean cricket in the shortest time possible, with the least possible reduction in individual and team performance. From 2001 to the current point of our story in 2004, the task force's prominence in decision-making increased, especially as the link between the task force and the regime did as well. It initially went about setting nationwide targets to increase wider participation in cricket, not only getting more non-white Zimbabweans to play cricket in schools and the grassroots, but also in these people attending the matches as spectators as well. But its most impactful goal was ultimately to change the composition of the national side. It is here where we need to have a closer look into the nuances of this issue. In a country like Zimbabwe, where the majority of the population is black, or at least non-white, any move in the national side to better reflect the demographics of the country it represents could be argued as a fair move. And for all the research I've done for this video, I have to say it's one that was pretty well supported, and one that Zimbabwean captain Heath Streak agreed with. The issue, as with many other things happening in Zimbabwe at the time, was the way in which it was carried out. We go back to the stated goal of the task force, which was to ensure the integration of Zimbabwean cricket with the least possible reduction in individual and team performance. In order to aim for A, the integration of Zimbabwean cricket with B, the least possible reduction in team performance, there needs to be replacement players in the related demographics of similar and or better quality to maintain the standard of cricket on the field. Now, Zimbabwe wasn't the best in the world, but they weren't that bad either. They had recorded test victories against all other full member nations, and in 2001 had beaten New Zealand in a series away, along with reaching the super stage of the 2003 World Cup. Some in the establishment of Zimbabwean cricket would argue, even without government intervention, there were already players of colour coming through the ranks. Tatenda Taibu, at the age of 20, had been announced as Zimbabwean vice-captain by this time. under Heath Streak, a very promising wicketkeeper batter with definite leadership potential. And in 2001, Hamilton Masakadza became the first black Zimbabwean to score a Test century, not to mention Henry Olonga, Douglas Hondo and others. But to maintain the current standard on the field, there weren't enough of them to replace the current players and their production. Furthermore, it became increasingly clear that a quota system was in place for team selections, even though it was never made public outright. Heath Streak again said he wasn't against the quota system per se, he was against the lack of transparency surrounding it. Quote, "I said that you've got to actually tell people if there's a quota system in place, because the young white guys are going to worry about whether they're doing the right thing by staying. At least if you do a quota system and you say that we have 3 or 4 players of colour, then they know they're fighting for 7 positions, or whatever it is." What likely needed to take place was the gradual progression of players of colour into the Zimbabwean team, taking over from other members as they met the twilight of their careers. This would give time for grassroots systems to be developed while progressively exposing the up-and-coming players to the rigours of international cricket. This, however, would take years, even decades. For a regime that operated in the way Mugabe's did, this was far too long. A statement needed to be made, and that's why they were pushing for bigger changes now. But there had to come a time where Heath Streak, who was the figurehead captain of the Zimbabwean cricket team, would take a stand against what was going on behind the scenes. For his teammates, if not for anyone else. This was where that list of demands came in. Streak wrote a letter to Vincent Hogg, the ZCU managing director, outlining his demands. Amongst them was the end of unofficial quotas, more stringent qualification requirements for the role of national selector, and the setting up of a players' association. Internally, within the ZCU, there were allegedly members that were arguing for further mediation with Streak regarding his demands, while others were more strident in not allowing the players to tell them what to do. A short while later, the ZCU met with Captain Heath Streak and Vice-Captain Tundra to try and resolve the matter, which ended in a stalemate. A few days later, Hogg would call Streak, but again, no progress had been made. Streak's ultimatum of resignation stood. On April 2nd, the ZCU would accept the resignation of Heath Streak as captain. Tundra was the new captain of the Zimbabwe cricket team. He would soon become the youngest captain in Test cricket history for that time. 11 contracted members of the team, all white, would back up Streak shortly afterwards, threatening to resign in solidarity with him unless he was reinstated as captain. On the 15th of April, 13 players went on strike, followed shortly afterwards by 2 more. Further unconfirmed reports also alleged that 3 players of colour were close to joining them, until they were confronted by a national selector and told to, basically, pick a side. Let's be real, any team, Zimbabwe or otherwise, would be hurting by losing that level of experience. But for Zimbabwe, the internal problems were about to be exposed in the international arena, in a big way. The day after, Zimbabwe named its squad to play Sri Lanka in a home series, and records were about to be broken. Sri Lanka's 2004 tour of Zimbabwe was the cricket world's first chance to see the new look Zimbabwe side. But 20 years down the line, it's difficult to show you the deficit in production and experience that Zimbabwe faced going into this series, especially as it's been difficult to source footage of Zimbabwe's home games from around this time. So let me try and explain it to you in a different way. On screen now is the team sheet for the third ODI between Zimbabwe and Bangladesh, the one that happened just before the big meeting at the start of the video. Next to it is their number of appearances or caps, along with career ODIs and wickets up to that point. The next one is this new 11 facing Sri Lanka in the first ODI. Even on first glance, the differences are clear as day. Collectively, we're talking about more than 500 ODI caps worth of experience lost, over 12,000 ODI runs, and over 350 ODI wickets. And that's even before we start talking about who they're up against. Jayasuriya, Sangakkara, Jayawardena, Dilshan, Vas, and Murali. Even though they were both full member nations, the gulf between the two teams was staggering. But the first ODI was by no means a walkover, Tundra scoring an unbeaten 96 in Bulawayo as Sri Lanka won by 12 runs. The second was much less close. Zimbabwe bowled out for 136, their total chased down in 20.5 overs. The most memorable ODI of this series, though, was the third.
Oh, that might be close. It's misunderstanding. Oh, it must be out. Yes, Matsakaniri was short of the crease. He walks.
In Harare, Zimbabwe were bowled out for 35 in just 18 overs, the lowest ever score in ODI history. The score caused such a ruckus internally that some ZCU officials claimed the pitch had been sabotaged by some of their own ground staff, under the orders of Managing Director Vincent Hogg, on account of both of them being white.
That's off the glove, I think. He's got him. It's another one. That's the end of the innings, and they're all out for 35, the lowest total in the history of international cricket.
Sri Lanka rested key players in the final two ODIs, but still won them, ending in a 5-0 whitewash. Certain members of the ZCU senior management were allegedly so enraged with the team's performances and what their selections had facilitated that they fought each other in the stands, while one also reportedly fired commentator Pommy Mbangwa because he commented on the team's performances, even though that was his job. He was reinstated shortly afterwards. And as for the tests, well, more records were broken. The first test was over in 3 days and ended as Zimbabwe's biggest ever test defeat, an innings and 240 runs. Mutai Muralitharan also surpassed Courtney Walsh as the highest test wicket taker of all time in this game. The second test led to Zimbabwe's record for the biggest ever test defeat being surpassed again, this time by an innings and 254 runs. Sri Lanka declared a 3 for 713, batting second, Marvin Atapattu scoring 249, Kumar Sangakkara 270, and Mahela Jayawardena 100. A truly disastrous display. But you can't really fault the players here. This is international cricket. If given the time to be nurtured amongst a group of experienced internationals, things might be different. But at this point, they just weren't ready. And while this series was going on, those players on strike had rejected further offers of mediation, ultimately being fired by the ZCU.
Oh goodness me, that was a shocker.
Seeing the abject nature of those defeats got the ICC involved. Consecutive losses of that nature and the fact that the players on strike were now no longer contracted to Zimbabwe brought into question whether Zimbabwe should retain its test status at all. Their next opponents were Australia, and an even bigger mismatch was on the cards. ICC Chief Executive Malcolm Speed flew to Harare, but initially the ZCU reportedly wouldn't meet with him. When he finally did get an audience, he informed the ZCU that he would table a resolution for the next series with Australia to not have test status. If not for a deal behind the scenes between the ZCU and Cricket Australia, where the tour wouldn't have any test matches, their status might have been revoked. The Australian tour ended in another whitewash, and when the matter finally reached the ICC board, discussion on their test status was postponed, as tests between England scheduled for later in that year were also deferred. For around 6 months until the start of 2005, Zimbabwe wouldn't play any tests. So, in effect, in order to save their test status, and let's be honest, their voting rights and the money that the ICC provides full member nations like Zimbabwe, the Zimbabwe Cricket Union had suspended itself from playing test cricket. A new low had been reached. Here, the link between the striking players and the national teams begins to veer off. During his time in Zimbabwe, the ICC's Malcolm Speed would meet with the group to discuss their situation, but the ICC stressed that this was an internal Zimbabwean matter and would not intervene much further. The ICC did, however, set up an inquiry into allegations of racism within the ZCU. The inquiry was initiated in Harare, but did not make much progress before it turned into a farce. The player's legal representative asked that his clients be able to testify on camera rather than in front of ZCU officials, as they feared that they would be targeted and victimised in the process. The ZCU's lawyer refused. With yet another impasse, the inquiry was closed with just 1 day of proceedings. Both sides submitted written submissions, and after a month, the inquiry found no evidence of racism within Zimbabwe cricket. The group of players, now without any further recourse and without jobs as professional cricketers, had to plan their next steps in life, even if it meant leaving their home for many of them. Although the ZCU excluded the team from the test arena, between the end of May and the start of December, Zimbabwe played 10 ODIs, both home and away. And with the exception of one abandoned match in Rawalpindi due to rain, all of them were losses, extending their streak to 18 ODIs without a win.
Outside, he's gone.
In the meantime, the Zimbabwe Cricket Union had rebranded itself as Zimbabwe Cricket, which is the name it goes by today. Reading articles of the time, there are subtle hints at the economic situation that Zimbabwe still found itself in. Here, Zimbabwe Cricket pledging 635 million Zimbabwean dollars to fund the development of up-and-coming schoolboy players. It sounds like a fairly significant amount until you convert it to another currency, like British pounds, to see that it amounted to a much smaller sum. When the time finally came around to play tests again, Zimbabwe would find themselves in Bangladesh. Somehow, coming off a self-imposed hiatus, this underexperienced test side was expected to perform better in what would be completely foreign conditions in the subcontinent. Bangladesh would record not only its first ever test victory, but through winning the first test and drawing the second, winning their first test series as well.
What a sight, the flag in his hand, Captain Habibul Basha leading from the front.
To save yet another whitewash, the ODIs proved to be a closer affair, Zimbabwe winning the first two before losing the series 3-2. If it wasn't already evident, mid to late 2005 could be seen as the time where it became clear just how much damage had been brought onto Zimbabwean cricket, where we begin to see all of these things that we've spoken about, from the government to the administration to the performances on the field, sort of all go up a level at the same time. Facing South Africa at Newlands for the first of two tests, Zimbabwe's loss would be historical in its scale. Even with Heath Streak and Andy Bligno back in the side, they were bowled out for 54 in little over a session, the lowest Zimbabwean test score in history. South Africa put 340 on the board in 50 overs before mercifully declaring. Zimbabwe was unable to reach South Africa's score, all out for 265, losing by an innings and 21 runs. The test over in 2 days. The next one, followed by two series against New Zealand and India at home, were all losses. 4 defeats by an innings or more, and 1 by 10 wickets. Both series that hosted New Zealand and India garnered their own controversy, and threats to boycott the tour in the case of New Zealand had surfaced, but ultimately never came to fruition.
Oh, so get him on the pad and give him, and Zimbabwe in all sorts of trouble.
Zimbabwe's loss and their scale heaped pressure on the ICC from the wider cricket media to consider Zimbabwe's test status once again. Zimbabwe Cricket's administrators then transferred this pressure and blame from themselves to the players and coaches, while they were being severely outmatched on the field through no fault of their own. During the New Zealand series, Zimbabwe coach Phil Simmons, who often found himself single-handedly defending Zimbabwe's place in test cricket against the media, was fired. Captain Tatenda Taibu, along with 30 players, including the majority of the national team, would rally behind Phil Simmons, sending a letter to Zimbabwe Cricket, asking for them to reconsider their position and to not make Simmons the scapegoat. Simmons would eventually sue Zimbabwe Cricket, stating that his firing went against their own bylaws. It appears that this matter was still before the courts as recently as 2018, and I couldn't find out if it had been resolved as of yet. Things don't end there though. In late 2005, Heath Streak ended his final stint as a Zimbabwean player, retiring from international cricket and focusing on county cricket in England. Also, Tatenda Taibu himself quit as Zimbabwe captain, arguably Zimbabwe's most consistent player during this time. In addition to providing Phil Simmons with support, he was front and centre in relaying the players' displeasure at the new central contracts that were being offered, which were heavily based on incentives ahead of a larger base salary. Taibu was vocal in speaking out against Zimbabwe cricket and how they were running the game nationally. This was at great personal cost and risk. In the years afterwards, he revealed that he was subject to regular threats of violence by people linked to the Mugabe regime, and that he and his wife were often being followed wherever they went whilst in Zimbabwe. This further reveals that behind the veneer of this Zimbabwe story being about race, or white versus black, it could be argued that it was about power and control, and exercising these things no matter what collateral damage would come as a result. Zimbabwe cricket itself would soon be in the sights of the Mugabe government. Towards the end of 2005, as a result of investigations by Zimbabwe's central bank, senior officials of the administration were arrested over alleged breaches to Zimbabwe's foreign currency exchange laws. The financial state of Zimbabwe cricket was in dire straits, and the players hadn't been paid since the South Africa series. Those officials were later released, but amidst allegations of financial mismanagement, the government would end up dissolving the entire board of Zimbabwe cricket and remove the majority of its members in the process. But strangely, the two people who had been arrested were kept in place. Zimbabwe's 10-wicket loss to India in the second test would be the Chevron's last test match for 5 years. Their place in the cricket landscape would almost reach a state of purgatory. They were still a full member on paper, but the omissions of key countries on their schedules were glaring, as more and more games were being played against associate level members. teams like India, Australia, England or New Zealand wouldn't face them bilaterally for years.
On the crease, plumb LBW, second ball, the worst possible start for Zimbabwe.
And it's here where I want to share a little personal secret of my own. I have a little soft spot in my heart for Zimbabwean cricket. Some of my earliest memories of watching cricket on TV as a kid is watching Zimbabwe play Australia. Seeing Heath Streak or Dougie Hondo bustle their way into the crease, or Andy Flower cutting bowlers to shreds behind point for 4.
Smashed that one away, great shot. Boy, does he play that shot superbly.
And in that spirit, as a fan, I would love to continue our journey here with Zimbabwe and hopefully end on a point in the next decade or so where all of these things have been resolved. But the fact of the matter is, there isn't one. It's true that many of the players who went on strike would find their way back to the national team, even for only a brief stint. Zimbabwe would restart playing tests again in 2001 and got a little bit of revenge on Bangladesh, beating them in their first test back. Zimbabwe even made it back to the World Cup on more than one occasion, with new stars emerging onto the scene. But with this has come more of the same type of issues we've seen so far. Players and coaches doing their jobs but being forced to go on strike because they've not been paid for weeks and or months on end. More allegations of financial mismanagement and misappropriation of funds within Zimbabwe cricket. And more, as the ICC put it, political interventions in Zimbabwe cricket, which would lead them to being temporarily suspended by the ICC in 2019. The fact is, for all the well-meaning intentions that many could say that this might have had, the efforts to integrate and or transform Zimbabwean cricket and the way in which it was carried out has left the overall sport in a significantly weaker position, from grassroots to the international level, through factors that, almost entirely, weren't related to the game of cricket at all. It's a case study and, dare I say, warning on what can happen to a national team when this type of policy is put in place in such a manner. I hope for the sake of Zimbabwean fans and world cricket that we see a strong, vibrant version of Zimbabwean cricket sometime in the future, free of all of these things. It even seems that we might be nearing towards something like that day by day. But for me, if there is one clear takeaway from this entire journey that we've been on, it is this. It was these 2 years that would set Zimbabwean cricket back decades. Before you go, I just want to share an important aside to this story. This has been one of the most difficult videos I've made to date in terms of research. The story that I have put before you is one that, I hope, covers most of the notable parts of this story. But that is not to say that this story is complete. There are several parts of this story that are important where I haven't gone into further detail, simply because I personally don't have first-hand knowledge of what happened in Zimbabwe at that time. And I couldn't find reputable sources with related information on the topic that could be cross-verified against others. These include the controversy around Zimbabwe's first-class system at the time, not only its overall deterioration in quality, but more serious allegations of blackmail levelled at Zimbabwean selectors. Similarly, it's also why I don't go into further detail over allegations of financial mismanagement within Zimbabwe cricket, or the central roles and decisions that specific Zimbabwe cricket officials might have had in facilitating this entire situation. If you want to learn more about these, I implore you to go away and spend some time looking into the situation for yourself and draw your own conclusions. A special thank you to Tristan Holm for his piece on this time period within Zimbabwean cricket for Cricinfo. His insights and research really helped steer where this video would eventually end up. Now, on that somber note, thanks for staying all the way through. If you liked it, please drop a thumbs up below because it really helps in getting these videos out to more people like yourself. And if you're new, please think about subscribing. There's plenty more videos on the way. If you need a little bit of cheering up, have a look at this inspiring tale of the 2016 West Indies team in pursuit of T20 World Cup glory. Hopefully, it can brighten your spirits up a little. And until the next one, take care, and I'll see you soon.